Welcome, everyone. We're glad you're here. If you would like to go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat, you can do that at this time. My name is Bridget Cabrera, she, her, hers, and I'm the Executive Director of Methodist Federation for Social Action. MFSA is an over 100-year-old justice-seeking, faith-based policy and organizing network. Our mission is to mobilize, lead, and sustain a progressive, united Methodist movement, energizing people to be agents of God's justice, peace, and reconciliation. And we are so excited to be co-hosting this series of webinars with our dear coalition partner, United Methodist for Kairos Response. A few announcements concerning our call today. If you find that you're having some audio or visual issues or internet connectivity issues, if you turn your video off, that might help as we're all joining the call. You all are currently on mute, but we will have opportunity to say hello after the call. Our webinars are a place to learn and engage, be in community together. And in order to create an equitable and brave space, we treat each other with respect on our calls, and we do not tolerate any hate speech in our conversations on these calls. We are recording the webinar, and that recording will be shared in the coming days. You can find it on either MFSA's or UMKR's YouTube pages. YouTube channels. If you have questions, feel free to type them in the chat at any time during the call. We'll be collecting those, and we do offer closed captioning. It is automatically generated, so do expect some spelling errors and other errors, but we're so glad you're here. Now we'll turn this over to our moderator, John Wagner.
Hello, everyone. I'm John Wagner. I am the outgoing co-chair of United Methodist for Kairos Response, and it's just a pleasure to be here. With colleagues from other denominations, and our goal today will be to discuss the ways that various denominations have organized themselves to advocate for a just peace in Israel and Palestine. And there are plenty of denominations who have been participating in this. Christian denominations. It's been an ecumenical effort, and there have been ecumenical organizations organizing this. We just thought that it might be interesting to have some kind of nuts and bolts discussion among three activists who've been offered up by their own denominations, their own denominational efforts to discuss these issues and the nuts and bolts of organizing, how one does this successfully, and also things we've learned through trial and error, some of the things that haven't worked. So we have with us Joe Roos, Noushin Framke, John Thomas. They are from the Mennonites, Presbyterians, and UCCs respectively. And we're going to start with Joe Roos. I'll introduce him and he'll share a little bit, and then we'll go through the other two and then have some time for question and answers, which we'd like you to put in the chat when that time comes. We'll open up the chat again in just a few minutes. Joe Roos is an ordained pastor in the Mennonite Church USA and has served churches in Washington, D.C., Maryland, India, and California. He's one of the founders of Sojourners magazine and has served as its publisher for 27 years. He has traveled to Palestine twice in the last 5 years. Joe is currently the chair of the Mennonite Palestine Israel Network, MennoPIN, and co-chair of Friends of Sabeel North America. The acronym is FOSNA. Joe. You got to unmute, Joe, sorry.
Thank you. It's a delight to be here with all of you. Thank you for the invitation, John. I do represent on this panel Mennonite Church USA's MennoPIN, and I'm looking forward to hearing so much from all of you. Mennonites have a long history in Palestine, Israel. In fact, beginning in 1949, just 1 year after the establishment of the State of Israel, the Mennonite Central Committee began operating in that part of the world. Mennonite Central Committee is an agency that's separate from our denomination, but does a lot of relief work and crisis work as well. Now, MennoPIN was formed in 2013 by a group of Mennonites, and I want to emphasize that we are not an official part of the Mennonite Church USA. We form separately, and we serve in a way to try and encourage the denomination's deeper involvement to and commitment to seeking freedom and justice and peace for the Palestinian people. We were formed to support advocacy and action, to develop and promote educational materials, and also just to join with other people of faith and conscience who share the passion for peace and justice in Palestine. MennoPIN was instrumental in the passing of a denominational resolution in 2017, but it wasn't easy. In fact, we had helped with others to try and pass a resolution in 2015, but it failed, much to our surprise. We thought it would be a slam dunk, but it wasn't. Instead, it was a real eye-opener for us on the kind of ways that we need to approach the denomination around this kind of thing, to be more strategic and to be better prepared than we were. And so for the 2017 conference, we did three things in preparation for that. One was we brought in people who actually voted against the resolution in 2015, but had brought them in to hear their concerns and involve them in it. We also crafted ways of saying things that would minimize the concerns. And we enlisted and prepared a good number of people on how to stand up and to argue for the resolution when it was debated in our delegate conference in 2017. Now, this strategy worked and the resolution passed, but at the same time, we didn't get everything that we had wanted. I mean, we had to give up using the words boycott, disinvest, and sanctions in the resolution. And we just had to use other language to kind of convey the same thing, but it was really softened down in that regard from our perspective. But this resolution was, we felt, a really good step forward. I want to briefly just say three things that we at MennoPIN think are important in our activism and our advocacy. The first, we think it's very important that denominational resolutions get translated down into the lives and views of the people in the pews. The resolutions are great, but unless it really goes in to change lives in the pews, it doesn't have as much effect as I would hope they would have. And so we're doing two things within MennoPIN right now to try and do that. The first is that we established something we call the Gaza Twinning Initiative. And in this initiative, we had two goals. The twinning is to bring congregations in the Mennonite Church USA into direct contact with people in Gaza, with entities in Gaza. And we want that to have two things. The first and most important was to show the people in Gaza that we care, that people in the United States care for the suffering that they're undergoing with the blockade that Israel has put up around Gaza. And the other thing was to inform us back here about what is happening on the ground and encouraging advocacy in doing that. You all might remember that back in the early 1980s, the Contra War in Central America really changed once church people went down there and visited and saw what was happening and realized that the truth was something different than what we were hearing from our government. And they brought that message back, and it did have an impact. Now, of course, nobody can go over to Gaza these days, but some kind of direct link through Zoom meetings we felt would really be helpful in that. And we've been doing that. And I'll just give you one quick example of the impact of that. Back in 2021, May, when the bombing was going on, the relentless bombing of Gaza, we were in one conversation. One of our congregations was in a conversation with the Gaza YMCA. That was one of the pairing or twinning relationships that we established. And the people there showed us some photographs of what was happening around YMCA, the damage the bombing had done to their village, and just talked tearfully about how the impact, people they knew who had lost their lives in the bombings, how the streets around them didn't look anything like they used to look. And they expressed to us how much it meant to them that people in the United States cared about what was happening to them. So that's one of the things that we're doing in trying to bring the resolution and its impact into our pews. The other thing has to do with Christian Zionism. As you know, Christian Zionism is bad theology and bad for Palestine. And yet many people in our pews, perhaps more by default than anything else, feel that we need to be supporting Israel. And so we're trying to get into the pews by doing two things. One is producing a resource that we're going to be distributing as soon as we can. The other is we have been in support of a tour that you probably know both of these people, Jonathan Katab, who's a member of the MennoPIN Steering Committee, and Alex Awad, were doing in the United States, around to congregations and schools and groups that were, many were evangelical, but others were denominational groups, to just talk about Christian Zionism. And we supported them in a variety of ways on that. So that's two of the ways that we're trying to move down into the pews with the resolution that's passed. A second thing is that we encourage that advocacy and action belong together. Like many of you do, we strongly encourage congressional advocacy for example, some of the things that Betty McCollum is putting forth, but others as well. We also encourage people to engage in direct action. One of those was in July of 2017, when FOSNA organized an action against a protest against the Christians United for Israel that was happening in DC. Several of us from our MennoPIN Steering Committee went there, and we encouraged other people within our denomination to go. And so that kind of action that also impacts advocacy is a second thing. And the third is we promote very strongly BDS and support those who pay the price. There was a woman in one of our Mennonite congregations in Kansas who was refused a teaching job because she couldn't say that she would not support BDS.
Joe, how's that woman doing now?
She's doing very well. In fact, ACLU took her case and actually won, in that Kansas said they can't anymore prosecute individual persons. And just the final thing that I want to say, and I'll end this, is that we also encourage local and national partnerships. I am involved in one called the Palestine-Israel Ecumenical Network of Southern California. I represent MennoPIN there. So those are the three of the things that we try to do at this point. And I'll go ahead and end right there, John.
Okay, we'll come back to Joe. I'd like to move now to, thank you, Joe. I'd like to move now to Noushin Framke, who is a Middle Eastern Christian, a Presbyterian elder. She came to this country in 1978, has been working for social justice, doing a lot of writing and creating educational documents for a faith-based audience. The principal author of Steadfast Hope and other materials that a number of us have used across denominations. She's a founding member of IPMN, the Israel-Palestine Mission Network of the Presbyterian Church USA. Welcome, Noushin.
Thank you very much. And thank you for that. IPMN does all the writing work in a team. So I was part of a big team. Thank you. And thanks for this webinar and the opportunity to share our experiences. So the arc of our work at IPMN over the last 18 years has been pretty wide. We started out with pushing our denomination to divest from Caterpillar. And then it became a call for full BDS as per the call from Palestinian civil society. We added education on apartheid, then on Zionism and Christian Zionism and settler colonialism and then decolonization. And eventually we started talking one state solution with equal rights for all citizens of Israel-Palestine. We started looking at the issue through an intersectional lens eventually and seeing that we need to join with other justice struggles because we're stronger when we're working together. We go back to 2004 when one lone church in Florida, led by Reverend Glenn Dixon, went on a trip to the region and was in the West Bank when they witnessed a home demolition by Israeli bulldozers. They were horrified by what they saw and came back determined to do something. And they sent a last-minute overture to our General Assembly to divest our holdings from Caterpillar. Because of them, that is also the year that our highest body mandated a mission network to educate Presbyterians on the plight of Palestinians. So in 2004, the denomination landed on the front page of the New York Times for voting to start a process which might lead to divestment if all else fails. And that's what led to bomb threats against local Presbyterian churches in the New York area that year. But we are indebted to Glenn Dixon and his church in Gainesville, Florida, for getting us started. Because of the nature of our issue, we have been on what we like to say is the bleeding edge. But this means we have incredible commitment and passion from our members. And in the early years, we used to say that we punch above our weight class. So I'm going to play this 2.5-hour video that shows the culmination of that 10-year process of BDS that led to us finally voting to divest from 3 companies, Caterpillar, HP, and Motorola Solutions. And then I'll talk about what happened after the video. So let's see if I can do this right. Good.
People get ready, there's a train a-coming. You don't need no baggage, you just get on board. All you need is faith to release who's a humming. You don't need no ticket, you just thank the Lord, yeah. People get ready for the train to Jordan, picking up passengers from coast to coast. Faith is the key, open the doors and board them. There's room for all of the love and lost to you. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, can you see me still, hear me?
You can hear you.
Okay, great. Okay, I love that video. I made it for a church in Rochester, and I thought I'd share it with you today. So that was our first 10 years pretty much. So what lessons did we learn? We learned that progress never comes in a straight line. There's always sideways steps, and even what appears to look like a backward step sometimes, but we do advance, and it comes in a zigzag road. We've learned that we need to be bold and have a moonshot, so to speak. Ask for a lot and be ready to take small steps towards that moonshot. We learned that these bold asks, which could turn out to be lightning rods, are actually helpful. In 2014, for example, we published Zionism Unsettled, which ended up taking the heat, even more than divestment that year, and that's the year that divestment finally passed. And after a 10-year effort to push BDS, and we got boycott in 2012 and a call for sanctions in 2010, we learned, we were left trying to figure out our next move when divestment passed. It took a while to redirect the ship, but we have a few ways that we're working and engaging now, and I'll mention three. So we have the Hosanna Project, which is, it has its own website, and it can be reached on the IPMN website. It is a preaching project to help those in leadership understand how scripture can be used against the human rights of Palestinian people. And we sponsor a seminar or a symposium to this effect. And they practice preaching using scripture differently than they have in the past. And it's been doing very well. It was virtual this past year, and it did really well. They spread it out over several weeks. We have a successful grant program in which we use a large part of our annual budget to give grants to worthy projects, mostly in Palestine. The grants are up to $5,000 each, and we give out about 5 a year. So that's been a good way to engage with Palestine and to get our membership to engage. And as I already mentioned, we have recognized that we need to work intersectionally with other justice struggles because we are stronger together. So for example, we endorsed the platform for Black Lives Matter early on in 2016. And as a mission network, we have been working through the grassroots on educating the public towards a tipping point. So if, for example, in the Philadelphia area, we have a group that runs seminars and Zoom webinars on our book, Why Palestine Matters. They've done dozens of sessions. In Atlanta, there's an active group that does a speaker series. They've worked for a long time with Jewish Voice for Peace partners there. In Rochester, New York, and in Dallas, we have groups that have run multi-day film festivals and that are now both going on over 10 years. I know that in Dallas, they've partnered with local Palestinians and offer free Palestinian food on the last day after the last film. And these groups bring in the filmmakers when possible for conversations. So our recommendation is just to get moving and start the ball rolling with a conversation. And a film is always a good way to go. Palestinian food is a bonus, of course, and it draws people in. And the bottom line is that we cannot let our community look away from this injustice. We need to keep this justice issue on their radar by holding ongoing small events in our own regions. I really recommend some of the short videos in a new resource called Focus Palestine, which I was involved in writing. I can tell you more about that if there's time in the Q&A. Is that my time, I think?
Just about there, Noushin. Any last word?
Well, I mean, so this new resource, which I can talk more about, has dedicated videos that go with every chapter. The chapters can stand on their own, but I really recommend these short videos. There's one on Christian Zionism. There's Jeff Halper talking about decolonization. And my favorite one is about Sumud, the word in Arabic for steadfast resistance. And this particular episode is about Palestinian culture. And it includes music and cuisine and embroidery, theater, poetry. So it really shows the Palestinian people not as just victims, but real people, their humanity.
Sheen, if you'd like to, while the rest of us are going on, you can put the link to that resource in the chat.
Very, very good.
Okay, let's move on. Thank you, Noushin. I'd like to introduce John Thomas, who is an ordained minister of United Church of Christ. And from 1999 to 2009, he served as general minister and president of his denomination. He's also served as its ecumenical officer, has pastored UCC churches in Connecticut and Pennsylvania, was on the faculty of Chicago Theological Seminaries, founder of the United Church of Christ Palestine Israel Network, UCCPIN, and now serves on its steering committee. John, so glad to have you.
And I'm glad to be here. Thank you very much, John. It's good to hear from these other groups, things that we're doing in parallel, but also some new ideas that we can take back. And hopefully this webinar will stimulate all of our groups to think more broadly about opportunities for us. UCCPIN was organized about 11 years ago, gathering a group of people who've had experience through travel, through relationships, through advocacy and commitment to gather together, not to be a pressure group within the denomination, but a grassroots movement that could support the work of our national setting of the church, but also encourage them to be more aggressive and more forceful. We've had fortunately for us, a very close relationship with our global ministry partners, and that's been a real gift for us. So while we were separate, we've had a very strong collaborative effort. We've grown to about 450 to 500 members, people on our mailing list. We have a steering committee of about 20 people. One of the organizing efforts has frankly been with our steering committee to lower the age, to bring in more young people, and to broaden the geographic diversity of our steering committee, which then enables us to begin to reach more people in our local communities. Our efforts have, as other groups, have focused to some degree on resolutions at our General Synod. Our first was in 2015 when we put forth a resolution that really addressed the issue of BDS. It was adopted, and that led to conversations, particularly with our United Church Funds, an investment organization in the church, and our pension boards. And we've had some success there, although changes in personnel have brought that a little bit to a stall at the moment, or a pause is probably a better way to put it. In 2017, we had a resolution on the military detention of Palestinian children. And this led to, I think, probably our most successful local organizing efforts. We developed a video called "How Are the Children?" And it was designed for both individuals, but also for congregational settings, for people to learn about this issue, and then to drive them in advocacy, particularly around Betty McCollum's bills. And we've, I looked on our website, we had over 2,000 views of a distinct website, How Are the Children? And over 4,500 people have watched our video, either as individuals or as members of congregational groups. And this continued, this was pretty much a 2 to 3 year program. It continues, but not as aggressively. But it was really helpful both to have this compelling issue that was very difficult for people to argue with in the denomination, but also to have a congressional hook to connect this with, so that people could learn about the issue and then move directly to advocacy. In 2021, we decided to respond to a cry for hope from Kairos Palestine and to offer a resolution at our General Synod, a declaration on a just peace for Israel and Palestine. And this introduced several concepts. One was that it was written in the form of a confession of faith, drawing on parallels from the Barmen Declaration in Germany in the 1930s and the Belhar Declaration in South Africa in the 1980s. We introduced in response to a cry for hope, the idea that what was happening in Israel, Palestine, what was happening to the Palestinian people is in fact sin. We introduced into our formal nomenclature in the denomination that Israel's policies are a form of apartheid. We tried to promote a notion that setting criteria for a just peace really asks us to look toward human rights and international law, and unlinking us to some degree from a singular focus on a two-state solution, as we've watched the facts on the ground really alter that reality. And then finally, reinforcing the call for boycotts of products from settlements, divestment from companies, and sanctions, particularly focusing on US aid. In response to that fairly recent resolution, we've organized 4 webinars with the Indiana Center for Middle East Peace, and they have focused on these themes from our resolution. What does it mean to say that the situation is a sin? What does it mean to call this apartheid? We've focused, as Joe mentioned, on Christian Zionism, but not simply the kind of far right-wing Christian Zionism that concerns all of us, but also the Christian Zionism that is implicit in many of our congregations and our liturgies and our hymnody and so forth. And then finally, what does a human rights framework for a future for Israel and Palestine look like? We're now in the process of editing those down so they can be available for congregational use in study groups. Along with this, we developed an implementation wheel, which kind of took people around the resolution from point to point to point with concrete steps that they can take. Developed a resource called Difficult Conversations, helping those who are skittish about this issue because of the impact on their relationship with the Jewish community, but also difficult conversations within the denomination for people who are not always on the same page. One of the, I think, more promising and more interesting, but very early initiatives, the United Church of Christ often gathers clergy in what are called communities of practice, where they can begin to discuss together how how they serve in local congregations, what their common problems, what their opportunities are together. So we're thinking about, could we develop communities of practice for pastors and lay leaders who want to take up this issue in their congregation, in their local setting, to provide mutual support to each other, and to share ideas, to share thoughts. It's going to be interesting to see how this happens. I think the goal is initially to have a model, a prototype, a group that will gather together, probably virtually, on a regular basis, to be mutually encouraging to one another, but also informing one another. We're also hoping to develop more regional PINs within the umbrella of UCCPIN. We already have ones in Connecticut, in the northwest part of the United States, in Baltimore, Washington, which carry out local initiatives, not directed by the national UCCPIN, but are consistent with our general direction and approach. I just want to make a comment about some of the challenges that we're facing. The challenge, in part, is challenges I know have been part of the other denominational PINs. How do you really encourage groups like our pension boards to divest? How do we get social responsibility investing to really take up this issue? And there was a group nationally that was working on this. I'm not sure that that's as active at the moment. We had a very active person in our United Church Funds. She's moved on to another position. That sort of waned. So that's an ongoing challenge. You make some progress, things change, and then it requires rebooting. Another challenge is the political landscape has changed, even though the policy landscape has changed. When Trump was in office, policy seemed so extreme it was easy to organize. Now people have lost some of the passion, even though the Biden administration is not a whole lot better. So that's a new challenge for us right now. How do we create a sense of urgency? And the other is, particularly for involving our congregations, as Joe talked about, COVID has really damaged many congregations. And that's been a real struggle, I think. It's been difficult to find openness and readiness to take up this issue when pastors and lay leaders in so many of our congregations are dealing with so many crises over the last 2 years. Finally, I will say that the title Words to Action is appropriate, but I also would like to make the point that words are a kind of action. And our resolutions, and I think the resolutions of others have taken, have been a source of great encouragement to our Palestinian partners, a sign of solidarity in the midst of what is often, I think, great isolation. And they do move people in our denominations, and we do see how these biennial conversations begin to gather more people to a deeper understanding. So I'll stop there, John.
Thank you, John.
And for inviting me.
Sure enough. Thank you very much. Thank all of you. We're going to move shortly into a Q&A session. I'd like to just share just a few reflections. This wasn't our original intention, but I want to just share a few ways that United Methodist for Kairos Response has done some similar things and had some similar struggles and successes. I guess what I would highlight is one, we are trying to be intersectional. Perhaps something that hasn't been discussed here yet is that we also have been trying to reach out to our right flank, if that could be a euphemism, evangelicals within our denomination. We're broadly we have broad theology, a broad constituency, not just here, but around the world. And we're a fairly, well, among the mainline denominations, pretty racially diverse and ethnically diverse. So we've been trying to hit all of those. And I think that's important to suggest to organizers. We've also done, as was mentioned just now by John, tried to work through regional bodies, our conferences they're called, and they have their own resolutions that they are able to do at annual conferences. Our own general conference is only every 4 years, but now because of COVID, it's been postponed several times. So that has become an important avenue for us. I think, and lastly, I would just say that, like it's been mentioned before, we do try to work with the so-called money people in our denomination, those who are concerned about what divestment might do, how ethical it is, what kind of precedents it sets, and so forth. And we have had some success with our own board of pensions, which controls most of our assets. But that took a long time. And I would reiterate, or I would underscore what was already said about how, it's difficult, but you have to keep trying and work with people who don't agree with you initially. I'd like to just go through the group again and ask this question that's been raised. How do you motivate volunteers? How have you motivated volunteers? And I can see everybody but John here. There we go. What have you found the best way to motivate volunteers, getting them to kind of move out of a general concern and into action? I think I'll start with Joe first, if you don't mind, Joe. Just a brief answer, if you don't mind.
Certainly. The way that we do it is especially tap into the people who subscribe to our monthly newsletter, our monthly update. And we encourage people to become more involved in the actions of MennoPIN and become more involved in their congregations.
Okay, thank you. Noushin.
Well, IPMN has, I don't know for how long now, has instituted a monthly prayer meeting that's actually on Zoom. And it's run by our one of our leaders, Katie Archibald Woodward. And it sometimes runs to an hour, but it's like half an hour to an hour. And it brings in people, and you bring your prayers, and it's a good way to kind of connect on a regular basis. And there was one thing that I was going to say that went out of my head. Anyway, I'll come back to that.
All right.
If I remember after John.
John.
I think we have a monthly newsletter that goes out. It focuses on our work, but it also includes a whole section of news articles that have been curated by one of our members that focus on issues that are happening on the ground. So that's important. That tends to reach an already motivated group of people. As I've spent a lot of time on this and talked to a lot of people who've been involved, clearly travel to the region has been a primary motivator for folks. They've gone and they've seen, and they come home energized, outraged, ready to be active. That, of course, is stalled over the last couple of years. Folks have not been able to go. There have been attempts to do virtual kinds of tours, but I think that's an area we're going to have to pick up again as that becomes more possible. And then, of course, the other very important thing is to keep putting Palestinian voices in front of people, to have direct relationships with Palestinians who can speak for themselves rather than us here being the ones. So that's a critical issue for us.
All right. Just
Okay, so
no, Noushin, go ahead.
So real quickly, sorry to jump back in, but so the thing that I was going to mention is something that I actually wasn't a fan of in the beginning, but then I realized the value of it, and that is having events, in coffee hour, to have Palestinian handicrafts and olive oil. And in the beginning, I used to think of these things as Band-Aids. Like, how much effort do we want to put into this? It's really a Band-Aid. It's not going to change the root cause. But actually, it's a great tool for engaging people in the pews. And I learned that no, don't discount that. It's a big thing.
Right. I think for us, it was challenging people to do something locally and giving them some tasks that might be achievable. Even in annual conferences, regional bodies that were very reluctant, they still could vote in a task force to study the issue. And sometimes that was very productive. So that was one of our motivations. Just the assumption that everybody would like to do something. People often feel powerless, and just giving them some task would be helpful. Anybody else want to follow up on those questions? Have you thought of anything else? Like Noushin, I'll give you all a chance. Okay, I would like to know a little bit about lobbying efforts, lobbying people in Congress and the federal government. Have any of you had success with that, or how have you tried to work that in? Again, why don't we start with John this time. We'll start with you, John.
We've had a pattern early on of annual meetings in Washington, and we're meeting in Washington both because of the hospitality of our national social justice body, public policy body, but also because it offered an opportunity to do advocacy on the Hill. But I think we're probably moving more in the direction of encouraging people to develop relationships in their home districts with staff in the home district, and meetings with representatives when they come home from Washington. And I think that's kind of going to be a more fruitful activity for us.
All right. Joe.
Well, I'd say in two ways. One, just like what John said, encouraging people to meet with their local representatives, not necessarily have to go to Washington, D.C. The other thing is that the Mennonite Central Committee has a Washington lobby office, and we support them in many ways.
Okay. Noushin.
Well, this is another area where I was proven wrong. At first I thought, oh, lobbying Congress, Congress is never gonna change. That's a waste of my time, because with South Africa, they came last, they tipped on the tipping point. They were the caboose, really, that when public opinion tips, they will tip with it. But I've learned over the years that it's really important to keep it going and just keep the pressure on them, and knowing that they will tip when public opinion tips. And we do, like the rest of you, have an advocacy office in Washington, and we do action alerts with them and support them. And they do something for Palestine. I think it's every third Thursday of the month. And we have a very active group with Capitol Hill in Delaware, a little regional group in Delaware that Reverend Bob Stoddard has known Joe Biden for decades. And so he's been quite active on Capitol Hill for years. So yeah, it's important, and if you can't get there, do it locally for sure.
Okay. I'm going to give you a choice here. We have a lot of questions coming in just now, so I'm going to give you a choice to answer one or the other. There was an interesting thought I thought about how do you, and one that I have is, how do you work within seminaries? The fact that clergy are often the most resistant and feel they have the most to lose by speaking out. And then kind of similar, how do you help folks stay on message about the crimes of Israel, and often with when the messenger is so often attacked, and helping people to resist those attacks and resist their fears. Noushin, I'm going to go with you first this time and go to the others. And we just have a few minutes left. So,
well, I think this is a really important, actually, part of our work, and reaching people in seminary is really important. And our Hosanna project, our preaching project, is now trying to focus on seminarians. You know, we've had trouble, and this, I'm sure we're not the only ones in engaging, you know, on people under the age of 40. But I think it's really important to invest time, talent, and treasure in that group, especially in seminary. Now, we don't have, beyond the Hosanna project, we don't have anything specifically, you know, it's just basically people in their own regions doing things with the seminaries near them. So it is happening, but in small ways.
got it. John.
This is not something we've taken on as a UCCPIN group. I will say that I think there's an irony here that our seminaries, which in the UCC, which like to present themselves as very progressive, get very shy when it comes to the issue of Israel-Palestine. And the reason is that many of them have long-standing nurturing of relationships with the Jewish community. In terms of their interfaith, interreligious engagement, for the most part, I think they've started with the Jewish community. So the Muslim relationships are slowly. And as a result, institutionally, there's anxiety about getting into this and really addressing this. And that's an issue we're gonna have to try to figure out how to crack. But we haven't really taken it on yet at this point.
Got it. Joe.
Yes, we're a small 6-person steering committee, volunteers. We have limits to what we can do, but we do point people to FOSNA, which Friends of Civil North America, which has a seminary and clergy action council that meets with some regularity and tries to, you know, penetrate the seminaries around the country with action around Palestine, Israel.
Okay. I think most of you dealt with, how about the broader question of clergy? This is a different kind of question, I think. How do you help clergy overcome their fear? I know that in our case, we've helped people to, you know, just really trips and encounters with Palestinian Christians, for some clergy feeling like they're being called by brothers and sisters in Christ to do something, and be able to say that has been helpful. What have you found in your situations? Joe, I'm going to let you tackle this first, if you don't mind.
Well, a lot of people who connect with MennoPIN from the Mennonite Church USA are pastors, and they are eager and hungry for more information about what's going on there, but also from a biblical theological perspective, how to approach this question with people in their congregations. And again, we provide what we can, but we also point to FOSNA again is an excellent resource for these pastors.
I'm going to interject here. I just was reminded by a colleague of mine, ChristianZionism.org can help with theological questions that people have. And I'm hoping that some of you have that, know of that, that website. John, can you help us here with how do you, I mean, in some ways it's a pastoral issue with pastors. How do you get them to move beyond their fears?
Yeah, well, I think we have to name the fact that the fears by and large are the strategic approach that some of the Jewish organizations take, which is to label any criticism as anti-Semitic. We're actually going to have a webinar on that topic to help folks understand the problem with that kind of insinuation. But also longstanding relationships with Jewish partners in their local communities. This is where I think these communities of practice that we're thinking of trying to develop might be useful. Get pastors to feel less isolated. And that helps to overcome fears, but also, if your fear is not balanced by a sense of outrage and urgency, the fear is always going to win. So we've got to continue to help people understand how urgent this is, to see what's happening on the ground. And that's where I mentioned earlier, the ebb and flow of the kind of public information that people are exposed to. I can get people excited and energized and interested. And then we have a change in administration. People think, well, Trump's gone, it's going to be okay. And now we see pretty similar policies moving forward, but without the sense of outrage and urgency. Or as Joe was talking about, when bombs are falling on Gaza, pastors get backbone against the fears. So I think we just have to continue to work on ways to create a sense of urgency, but also understand that local relationships are important to people, and they need tools, and also working with groups like Jewish Voice for Peace to recognize that there is not a monolithic Jewish response.
I was just about to mention that JVP has been helpful to all of us. They're organized not only nationally, but locally. Noushin, can you give us a brief answer?
I mean, there's safety in numbers, right? And IPMN, when there's something hitting the news, we try to put out a statement that, gives cover and also speaks boldly, because we're speaking as a network, not as an individual. So, it's always good to connect people who are fearful to be bold to networks like ours, so that they can be part of a group that's moving as a group. And of course, reminding them of the ecumenical deal, as Mark Ellis coined the phrase ecumenical deal, just put that back on the front burner about the ecumenical deal and what it is and why it's important to speak out. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
All right.
If I can add just briefly, I was reminded the United Church of Christ works with the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in our global ministries, even though we've had different tracks in terms of national resolutions. But just recently, their national leadership put out a very, very helpful, very thoughtful pastoral letter or statement on this issue. And so working with our national leadership to encourage and push and prod a bit for bold statements also, I think, is a way that helps local pastors feel that they have some backing and they're not simply out there on their own.
All right. Friends, we've come to thank you all, Noushin and Joe and John. We've come to the end of the hour. Just our goal here was not really to provide comprehensive, plan for changing hearts and minds within all our denominations, but rather to stir the pot to begin this conversation. And hopefully that will continue. I'm going to ask that our participants today, our presenters, each of you just offer us any kind of documents or materials you'd like anybody else to see, and we will try to get them to people as we do a follow-up for this webinar. We're closing up now, and I'm going to turn it back over to Bridget Cabrera to close us out, and then you can stay on. We usually have a nice little chat. You'll be unmuted. We do ask that you have good manners and not dominate the conversation, but this will be a more free-flowing conversation. Bridget.
Hey, everyone, thanks again for joining us today. Thank you to our speakers. If this conversation was recorded, and so in the next couple of days or so, you'll be able to find it on both MFSA and UMKR's YouTube channels, and also additional resources. And I want to draw your attention to the chat. I will drop information there about the Doctrine of Discovery webinar series that we are also doing. Our last session in that series is in April 27th. I hope you can join us. Undoing the Doctrine, Developing a Theology of Repentance and Repair. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and be on the lookout for information on our next webinar.
Just a note, I think that Dr.